So welcome all to the GBSN Cross-Border Coffee Break webinar, Business Schools and the Coronavirus. Today's webinar includes representatives from that was this morning's webinar. This afternoon's webinar has members from MIT Sloan School of Management, ESSEC Business School, SFU Beedie School of Business, as well as Lagos Business School. I'm Rob Vember. I am the Communications and Networking Senior Advisor for GBSN. And as you have joined today's webinar, just to inform you that you will be in the listen and view mode only, which will not allow you initially to activate your webcam nor your microphone. During the last 20 minutes, we'll do a Q&A discussion. If you'd like to pose a question or submit a comment, please do so by clicking on the Q&A button in your tool tab. A Q&A box will pop up and then send through your question. Type your question or comment in the box. Please make sure that you type your name and your institution and your organization as well, so that we know exactly who you are, and then send it through to us. When it comes to the Q&A portion towards the end of the webinar, we'll identify you and ask you to please we'll turn your microphone on from our side and ask you to do so from your side, and then pose the question to the panel and the rest of the participants. Now, as we get going today, we thought we'd like to start things off with a poll for you to have a look at and answer, as Dan does the rest of the introductions. If I can just briefly read through the poll questions. Number one, how would you characterize your institution's preparedness to deal with the COVID-19 outbreak? Question two, how agile has your institution been in dealing with the consequences of the COVID-19 outbreak? And question three, how would you characterize changes made at your institution to address the COVID-19 outbreak? So Dan, you can take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. We appreciate your description of the process and your willingness to keep us on track as we go with this webinar. We know that we have very little time, and we will do our best to make sure we get as much out of the panelists as possible during this time. And as Rob pointed out, we will leave time at the end of the webinar, hopefully as much as 15 minutes for questions and responses from the group. Now, by now, Rob, how are we doing with the poll? Are you ready to post?
We have about half of the attendees who have answered. The number's slowly ticking up. If we give it 10 more seconds.
All right, 10 more seconds it is. Well, we're really happy that all of the panelists can join us. David Capodilupo at MIT, who's head of the global programs, is joining by phone at the moment rather than by video. So sorry you don't get to see his handsome face. There we go.
Yeah, I'm not that pretty today. It's
okay. How would you characterize your institution's preparedness to deal with this? You know, I'm actually seeing these numbers starting to rise. It's interesting that more and more of the responses as we've done this poll are in the somewhat prepared category, whereas a larger proportion were in the not at all prepared category. But I also need to say, you know, independent of the poll, which all of you can see, you know, I've been impressed by the responses of business schools, both in terms of the breadth and how many things they've seemed to touch on, but also in terms of their fluidity and adaptability as things change. Now, I'm sure we'll hear from our panelists some questions about whether or not many of the things they've done have worked or are working. What some of the challenges are, but I should say that up front. This is a very difficult time, more difficult a time than I can recall in 30 years of working both in and with business schools. Everything else that I've experienced or we've experienced seems rather isolated compared to this. And also it seems that most of the other things were more temporary. This seems to persist and will persist over some time. So we have a lot to talk about. I'm not going to take any more time with this. I want to just do a quick round of introductions And if you will, panelists, could you just raise your hand and say hello to everyone? That way they begin to recognize your voice as I call out your name. So from the Lagos Business School, we have Charles Evanso. Charles, who is the Director of Finance and Administration.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
Hey, thanks, Charles. Carolyn Egri from Simon Fraser University. That's the Beedie School in Vancouver, which I hear a lot about here for a lot of reasons, including that it's the future location for the upcoming Academy of Management event, which may or may not be experienced in the same way as it has before. Carolyn, you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone.
Great, Carolyn. Thanks. Carolyn's Associate Dean for Research and International. We have Felix Papier. I'm not sure I said that correctly, but Felix, correct me if I didn't, who's head of the Grande École at ESSEC Business School. That's typically in a school like ESSEC, this is the most senior associate dean in charge of the most important program. He's also director of the pre-experience programs. Felix, you want to say hello?
Hello, Felix.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Felix. And then we also have by audio, as I mentioned before, David Capodilupo, who's the head of global programs at MIT Sloan. And David, you want to say hello? Can't raise your hand. Right?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. I am raising my hand in the parking lot. People think I'm strange, but it's okay. But happy to be on this call. Very happy to be on this call.
Well, thanks so much, David. Why don't we start with you? You know, you were kind enough to share with me, I think it was last Thursday. I was traveling at the time. I was in Michigan, and you shared with me the letter from the MIT president that articulated what the next steps were in terms of the MIT response. What has been the most challenging part of that response from your perspective at the MIT Sloan School?
Yeah, I think the challenge is that this keeps changing every hour and every day. So it's how do we keep up with this, and how do we form a communications network that is efficient? Because we have the Sloan School, we have MIT, we have all these different centers and labs that we have to coordinate all this. So that's been a challenge. So we're trying to do is we have triage meetings on a regular basis, and we're trying to break it down so that we have 5 groups of all MIT that are working on specific things, such as medical, quarantine, MBA students, international faculty visiting, so it doesn't seem overwhelming. And these committees work independently and then report back. But I think the most challenging, what continues is that this just changes on a daily basis, so we have to keep up with this. And we have a lot of decisions that have to be made between now and actually the end of the year. I think it's most hardest on the MBA, MPhil students, but we also have to keep in mind that it's our staff. Sometimes they're focused on students and faculty and interactions, but there's also a fear factor that we have as leaders to also balance those 2 issues.
Great. Well, thanks for that, David. We'll come back to another question about that letter that I'm sure hits you in the very heart of your professional work as head of global programs, and that for the time being, international travel is suspended for MIT. Did I understand?
Yes, I have 2 people. Yeah, I have 2 people who are in London right now. We're coming back tomorrow, and that should at least have a clean slate. So we're looking forward to that.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing. We have a lot more to talk about, David. We'll come back. Felix, you know, with campuses in Morocco and Singapore, the Singapore experience must have put you pretty much at the front end of a lot of the work happening with coronavirus, now COVID-19. You want to tell us a little bit about that experience and what's been most challenging?
Yes, so our focus at the moment is on maintaining operations, so that is programs programs, recruitment, admissions, and so on, and on taking measures to protect our students and to protect everybody on our premises. And the fact that we do have 3 campuses, so one in Africa and Morocco, and one in Singapore, and the main campus Paris, that contributes a lot to the complexity. So at the beginning, we try to have a consistent policy on every throughout the 3 different campuses. But then there are so many constraints or instructions from the government in each of the 3 different countries that we could not uphold that. So at the moment, we follow a government policy in each of the 3 different countries. And then also the virus is in different stages. So for example, in Singapore, already 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a lot of discussion and a lot of measures, for example, such as taking temperatures for everyone who comes on campus, special procedures if someone has a fever or other symptoms, treating with, for example, students who went back to their home country because they were afraid and did not want to come back. And at the moment, that is becoming more and more important, that discussion in France. And in Singapore, it's a little bit stabilizing. So what we learned from it is that every campus we have to treat differently because of the context, the requirements from government and so on.
Well, it's interesting, the parallels with what David said about the communication and managing many different moving parts. But it sounds like the neat part about your experience is that you were able to learn quickly, potentially, from the Singapore experience. So you got to be at the leading edge and bring things back. So thanks for that opening, Felix. Let's turn to Carolyn now. In the news that I've seen recently, Vancouver, where Simon Fraser is very near to becoming a bit of a hotspot in terms of what's happening with coronavirus. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how this has evolved on your campus and what you're doing?
Certainly. A lot of our actions have been involved with the study abroad, for example, the international student exchanges. That's actually where was our key initial part. And SFU is a lead host institution for the API conference. So that's the Asia Pacific International Association for International Education. And so that was scheduled to take place on March 22nd starting, and March 1st, they had to call it and cancel it with 3 weeks notice, just because of the health and safety concerns. So we've been dealing with that because, of course, we've had a lot of organizing around that. And so that will directly affect our programs in terms of international exchanges. So for us as a business school, one of our first responses was to reach out to all of our international partners that we had scheduled meetings for. And instead of having in-person meetings, we're going to be doing virtual meetings, just so that we know that things may be difficult in this coming year. So we are going to, I guess, keep the relationship. We really want to think past this crisis. So that's just one example of how we've had to adapt quickly. And as you mentioned with the Academy of Management, we'll see. They are still hopeful on their website.
Okay.
Hopeful on their website.
Yes.
I understand that. Can I maybe probe just a little bit further? You started by talking about student exchanges being part of your initial work. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the choices you made in that context? Are your students indeed studying abroad now as we speak, or were there some limitations? Or
well, students were pulled back or they were not sent. So students are not, we had canceled Hong Kong for the spring semester because of the political demonstrations. And then China was added quickly. But there are restrictions now for all the students. And so what we've needed to do for those students who were scheduled to go is find alternative places for them to go, postpone, maybe stay at SFU and enroll. So we've been reaching out individually to those students And now that things have erupted, globally, we're doing a high priority for summer programs. In some countries, they've just been canceled, unfortunately. So we're reaching out to the students to ensure that, to address their concerns, but also to ensure that if not now, then later they can have an international experience, which is really important.
Right. Now, these are what, semester-long programs. Do you also do, I'm assuming, do you also do short-term
Yes.
projects?
Yes, there's field schools. And there's study tours, study tours in others. One example is our MBA applied project. It's a full-time project, and they're originally scheduled to go half the cohort to Hong Kong, the other half to Singapore. Because of the political issues in Hong Kong, we diverted everybody to go to Singapore. And that was scheduled to take place in April. The problem for us was, of course, Singapore went on high alert. And part of that was that students who had a People's Republic of China passport were no longer permitted to enter Singapore.
Oh.
So that part created a lot of concern, and we said we can't split up the cohort in addition to the health concerns. So then we diverted to Panama City because nothing had been arranged there and no coronavirus yet. However, because of the concerns about the health and safety, not only in destinations, but also being on an airplane. And so there were, last week, unfortunately, we had to cancel that. And so now the students, instead of going on their international trip, we are doing a replacement course here in Vancouver. So they're not traveling this year.
I understand. That is unfortunate. I was probing a little bit because, just trying to understand the alternatives, because I hear a lot of schools struggling with this question. It's in some sense very easy to cancel a program, but what can you put in its place that provides a similar experience or opportunity for students to learn? And in my view, there's no substitute for true international experience where you get to be a part of the culture. So this is going to be a tough one. Now, Charles, and I was happy to be in Nigeria earlier this year in January, and visiting on your campus. And it seems to me like it's a beautiful place with a lot to offer, but already with a number of challenges in Lagos and Nigeria in general. I'm wondering, at these early stages of the virus in Nigeria, how are you thinking about this? What kinds of plans have you put into place?
Thanks, Dan. So the first thing we needed to do was to manage the sense of paranoia within our community and within the society. The moment the index case in Nigeria was announced, the sense of paranoia in the society generally went up several notches, and that obviously was something that our students also expressed in very many ways. So the first thing we needed to do was to deal with that by one, providing a lot of information. The science is pretty clear, and therefore what we wanted to do, or what we tried to do, was to assure everyone that we were putting the right measures in place, and that if everybody would, follow the directions that we were providing, then there didn't need to be a lot of anxiety. And to back that up, the first thing we did was to constitute a response team. That response team was led by the compliance function within the school. And then, of course, it had HR, it had facilities, it had medical. And the idea was to develop a series of responses for the immediate and for the medium term. essentially the immediate required that we would have a number of activities in place. The first one being that we would provide hand sanitizers across the campus at all entrances, in all classrooms, in all the bathrooms, everywhere. We made sure that there was, you couldn't turn in any direction without finding a sanitizer that you could use. That was one. But then we also had to have some access control measures. So for example, temperature checks at the entrance was something that we had to institute. So, you know, whenever anybody was coming into the building, even if you had been in the building before, you had to have your temperature checked. And then the basic hygiene, cleaning of surfaces, typically doorknobs, desks, you know, any area where there was a very high likelihood of physical contact. You know, we had the facility team make sure that they had a very consistent program of cleaning. And what that has done is to, well, I mean, the fact that we had all of these activities going on has generally helped to reduce the level of anxiety. And now we're looking now at monitoring the environment to decide at what point we begin to implement the medium-term arrangement. So we're envisaging a situation where if the situation escalates, then we'll begin to think about remote work, remote learning, and begin to have resources and systems in place to manage those.
Great. Well, you know, this plan for remote both meeting and, you know, functioning as well as learning, of course, has been a challenge for many schools. I think even today, we've seen a number of US-based schools announce that they've moved, or they are moving everything online. One of the things I've heard from schools about is how challenging that can be. Now, if I remember correctly, being at the IESE Business School, at the moment, none of your teaching occurs online. Is that correct? Or do you have some experience on what you can do?
Oh, yes. For the last 3-4 years, we've been experimenting with online programs. And no, actually, longer than that. So we have 3 programs on the MBA, 3 MBA formats. No, two MBA formats, rather, that are blended. That means that, you know, some of the learning is delivered online and some of it is face-to-face. So in principle, we have about 4 or 5 years of experience developing online remote learning systems.
David, who was it? David, are you there? Was it you?
I'm here. Yeah.
With me, a posting recently by a professor who provided insights into how to you know, move something you've done in a residential environment online and do it rather quickly if you're a professor. Was that you that sent me that resource?
No.
Sorry. Well, it's one of those things that I think I should put out there, because it does appear to be one of the challenges that we're facing in this environment for many faculty members who've not yet had the experience online. It's been a fairly difficult challenge. I think, did we just, yeah, okay. Good. But, you know, maybe David, while you're unmuted and online, you know, we talked a little bit earlier about travel, and you know, one thing popped out of the letter that you sent me that the president had posted, and that is that there's a confidential travel registry for the institution. Could you, this is the first I've heard about something like that. Is it possible for you to tell us a little bit more about how that works and what the benefit is and things like that? David, did we lose David? I think we lost David for a second, just in time. Why don't we shift gears? We'll come back to David on that question. Carolyn, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, we actually do have a travel registry, and we encourage our faculty members to register. However, I must admit, it's not complete. Staff are more likely to register on that, and students, of course. Students who study abroad need to register, and that way we're able to reach out to them quickly with any alerts, health and safety alerts. So that's we've had established for quite a while. It's very helpful, especially when people are mid-semester, for example, abroad.
So it sounds like it's required, not voluntary. Is that right?
For the students, yes. And they also have to buy certain travel insurances and such. So, but yes, we find it very helpful, and I'm hoping that our faculty members take advantage of that more in the future. But yeah, especially with, in the past, it's been around political changes or security issues in a location, but I think that the health might prompt them more to register on that, because if they are abroad and there is an alert on a location because it's fast changing, WHO might declare something, they need to know right away, and whether or not how we can make arrangements coming back home. So it's very helpful for us for pulling our students back from Hong Kong, for example, in the fall.
Right, and for communication, is it now just to probe just a little bit further on behalf of all of our viewers? I'm wondering, is it is something that you also encourage for personal travel or just for professional travel?
Sorry, it's David. I got kicked out. Sorry.
No worries, David. We'll come back to you.
Okay.
So far, it's been for professional travel, but there's nothing to stop somebody from registering for personal travel as well.
Okay, and
they're employees.
Is this something that the school built, or is it
yes,
a platform that's available to anyone?
I could look into it, but I just know it's available internally for our community members.
David, sorry we lost you there for a second, but Carolyn stepped in and addressed the question. I recalled reading in the letter from the president about a confidential travel registry. And I was wondering about its purpose and its effectiveness and how it's worked out so far. For Carolyn, she says they've had one for several years to help manage for communication and really so that the school could be more supportive of both staff and students while they're traveling abroad.
Yeah, no, we do have that. We've always had it. It is confidential. I think that sometimes telling people what to do is difficult in terms of some faculty or staff to do it. But the issue is, since all travel is banned internationally, that's not an issue. It's the students. We have spring break coming up. So all official school trips and treks have been canceled. The problem we're having is with the airlines. They're offering discounts to go to Tahiti for like $10 or something. So we have students who are saying, let's do this. You know, we'll be careful. So they have to register, but it's, you know, when they return, you know, how do you determine what a hot zone country is now? So, and we joke they're using the negotiation skills we taught them against us now in terms of justifying going to these places. So it's kind of interesting, but that's our biggest concern is students who are saying, well, I'm going to take advantage of this. It's my spring break. I'm graduating soon. So we have to keep an eye on that. But for the other travel, we do have a confidential registration that has been always available, but now it's being implemented even more.
Right. Well, that's something I think might be helpful for others, but it does raise the question that I think both you and Carolyn had touched on, and, you know, we don't need to drill down on this further, but, you know, the question between, you know, professional obligation and personal privacy. And I know this is a challenge for a lot of the choices that schools and individuals need to make in the current environment. You know, for example, when it comes to travel, you know, there may be not only personal preferences, but there are also issues related to people that one might be caring for at the home or working with elderly folks or people with any kind of communities.
Yeah.
So this tension between the professional obligation and the personal privacy is a pretty important one. Shifting gears yet again, I appreciate that the panelists have been willing, we talked about this in advance, for a fast-paced sort of shifting gears kind of conversation. Felix, you know, one of the things I have heard is that we know that the testing centers in hotbeds around the world have been shut for several weeks now, I think, and at some point will reopen. But that means candidates from places like China and South Korea and Iran and Italy have not been able to take things like the GMAT and the GRE and the TOEFL. I'm wondering how are you handling that, since I suspect you get a fair number of applications from those parts of the world.
Yes, so that is a point well taken. So that is actually a difficulty for our recruitment and admission teams. You mentioned the GMAT and TOEFL admission tests, but then there are also other points. So for example, even getting grading sheets or certified copies of diplomas from institutions in China or in Italy, since they are closed at the moment, it's not possible. So there are a lot of points where students, candidates at the moment, have difficulty filing a regular application. And we have already for 3 to 4 weeks, for 4 weeks now, been trying to be as flexible as possible with that. So, for example, for the English test, where you have to have a given minimum level, and for any documents, we just allow that they are submitted later on. Slightly more difficult cases for the GMAT, because that's part of the overall application package. So what we are going to do here is that we allow for students from these zones. So at the moment that is Italy and China, but probably in the future there will be more, to allow them to submit the application without this information. And then we will make a conditional admission, conditional on having them supply the GMAT score later and the minimum level that we will specify for each application.
Great. Thank you, Felix. Carolyn, you're nodding your head. Is this the way you're approaching the situation as well?
Yeah, we're thinking about it in terms of, we're anticipating a real problem in terms of having applications completed from affected zones so far. And so the flexibility, I totally agree with Felix that we need to be flexible in terms of our admission requirements, because this is not going to last forever, and the students shouldn't be penalized because they happen to be in a place where the ability to write these exams, and for some of our field schools, we can't even get for one summer program for a couple of our partners in China, everything's closed, so they can't even get visa applications started. So yes, having that flexibility, I totally support Felix on.
I'm making note of this for many reasons. I want to, first of all, allow Charles, if you have any similar experiences that you'd like to share, but I'd also like to shift gears right after that and talk a little bit about how we're doing on the career side. You know, I've heard, at least in some cases, that it's been a little bit of a challenge on the placement dimension. Charles, you want to comment on either the admission side or the career side, or any other type of student support that we would normally provide that are actually pretty important for business education?
Yeah. Well, on the admission side, we're not that much impacted for 2 reasons. One is that we don't have a lot of international students. Some of the international students we have are resident in Nigeria, and others come from within the West African region. And currently, the prevalence of cases in this region is still very low. So right now, we are more or less in an anticipatory mood, basically scanning the environment and trying to sort of anticipate the kinds of developments that will likely happen a few months, out. And in terms of the careers, still, no, I don't think we have much of a problem there as well. Career placements are still going on very well. Companies are also doing the basic control activities for their employees. But in terms of scaling down operations, though, things are still very normal here.
Great, great. Thanks for sharing that. I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk a little bit about faculty. Faculty are in many ways no offense to students, but in many ways faculty are the lifeblood of a university, and they are in this case always generally a bit older than the typical student, perhaps a little less experienced on the online environment. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but also tend to travel and to present their research and things like that. How is the interactions with faculty and the support from faculty been on your campuses? If any one or two of you want to volunteer to talk a little bit about how you've been working with faculty in general. Felix, did you want to touch on that? Yes.
I should just some information. So first of all, the French government has asked higher education institutions in France to cancel all business travel outside the European Union. So that means that also for faculty that who is planning to present at the conference or to go on a research visit outside the European Union, that has to be cancelled at the moment. And then one other point is where there's a lot of discussion with the faculty. That is whether to move courses so 100% online, so not to teach it physically anymore, or not to do it, or to do something in between to allow some students to do it or not. And there, every faculty member has a different opinion, also different level of experience. And so there we are trying to set a school-wide policy that is then consistent for the students in the different programs, so that they do not have one course online, the other one not online, but they still have to come for this one course which is not online, and so on. And so at the moment we set a policy that we maintain the courses all in the physical campus form.
Great. Thank you. David, I don't know if you were trying to add to that, or, I think, one of the things I heard from you, David, when I visited once was how the faculty like to think about the impact that they have in their communities. And
yeah,
and this is one instance where I suspect that business faculty have a lot to offer in terms of how our communities are dealing with coronavirus. And I'm wondering if you might comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's like our global program staff. They're used to traveling a lot to do research, actually to learn from other professors at our partner schools. So, and as you said, some of them feel comfortable doing online learning, some don't. So this is something we're trying to do on a case-by-case basis. The one thing that we have, I don't know if Caroline mentioned this earlier, someone else, our relationships are multi-year. So we could say to a partner school, let's postpone or delay something we're supposed to do, maybe to the fall or next year. Does that work with your curricula? And in the interim, maybe we could do some, online discussions with some of the students. But I think for some of our faculty, it's going to be very difficult to change some of the courses that they were planning to teach in person. In terms of the research part, I think that's still yet to be determined on how we assist them. But we're doing it on a country and school case-by-case basis, and the faculty involved with that.
Great. I appreciate those comments. You know, I've heard also related to this that many faculty members are using the opportunity to do research that might be informed by what's happening with coronavirus, including business resilience. And I've heard at least a couple of schools introduce a new course about business resilience that is particularly useful in today's environment as a substitute in some cases for the travel abroad. You know, one final question for the panelists before we move into the Q&A with the participants. You know, and I appreciate whatever you're willing to share about this, and maybe we'll start with Carolyn. I've heard that one of the challenges from a medium to long-term perspective that schools are trying to deal with is the impact on students in terms of the way they're perceived and treated by other students. And in the sense that if a student has just come back from a hotbed or a place where there may be a little bit more of an escalated presence for the virus, that they're treated differently, perhaps isolated in some way from other students. I'm wondering if you could comment about that, or has this not been an experience on your campus at all?
It really hasn't. However, for you know, our vice president academic and we have a number of facts on our central website, as well as what we communicate internally. We really emphasize that people who are or could be affected should be treated with understanding and empathy. So we haven't experienced what I think in terms of people being targeted in any way, but actually trying to support people who may, through no fault of their own, have been exposed to this virus, and to encourage people, of course, repeatedly around the importance of self-isolation, but also supporting them in that, make sure that they're not disadvantaged.
Right, right. Any other comments from the other panelists about this and whether you think it's a long-term risk? No?
Well, yes, that's something that we're quite concerned about. Again, in terms of travel, we're actually thinking about articulating a policy on travel generally. And part of it will be to identify what will be the high-risk areas, and you know, also consider the possible risks, you know, for flying, even if the destination is not a high-risk area. But in Nigeria, the Center for Disease Control has issued an advisory that requires that if you're returning from a high-risk area, you should self-quarantine. You know, so you isolate yourself for 14 days, and you know, and if you develop any symptoms in that period, then you call in and report for you, so that you can receive the necessary medical attention.
Right.
So it's an advisory. It's not in any way, it doesn't have a force of law or anything. But I think that interestingly, the Director General of the Center for Disease Control here had just returned from China, and you know, decided to self-quarantine as an example for what should be expected of everyone who visits a high-risk area.
Well, thanks for
and I have something, if I can add. I said this at a meeting yesterday where I think we can be very good at our clinical and engineering operational approach to this, but I think we have to balance this with a little EQ. So, for example, human beings can do wonderful things, and they can do some not wonderful things, especially when there's fear. So I think that it's important that, I mean, this call we focused on faculty and students. I don't think we talked about our staff at all. So there's an implication too that I have people who I work with who are struggling with cancer, who may be pregnant, etc. How do we make sure that we support them also as they support students and faculty. I think that's extremely important. And I also think fear can be such a dangerous thing that what are we doing on our campuses to alleviate that? Should we be setting up information booths, you know, just for Q&A? Should we have testing on site rather than, you know, at hospitals? But are there mechanisms that we can do to help our staff and create a culture within our schools that helps that fear part? And that's, I think that's one thing that's on my mind as we go through this. And, you know, I have staff who are wondering, are they going to lose their jobs if this virus is around for 2 years? Because global programs is all about global programming. So how do we deal with that? And I think is extremely important.
Thanks for sharing that. All of you, thanks for sharing that. We'll move now to participant questions. We're asking my colleague Rob for assistance. As he pointed out, he's going to select or help curate the questions, but then open the mic for the question to be posed to the panelists.
Yeah, so Dan, just to, I'm in turn going to toss to Nicole as we're having some technical difficulties, but so Nicole will take us forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Well, as mentioned, I've received a few questions already, but if you would like to pose a question, please submit it in the Q&A tab on your toolbar, and I will call on you when it's your turn to pose your question to the floor. So first question from Kumeshni West from the University of Cape Town Graduate School of Business in South Africa. Kumeshni, you now have the floor. Please pose your question. Kumeshni? Okay, so I will read her question for her.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. So, if you can hear me, so great. Yeah. So my question is, you know, we've talked about students, talked about faculty, but we haven't been talking about clients. And I'm specifically, I'm the Director of Executive Education, and I am trying to manage clients and financial fallout from cancellation. Our study tours, as well as our customized programs. And I'm having to manage contractual hires as well as adjunct faculty members. You know, have any of you dealt with this at your schools? Because it's been very challenging to manage this at my school. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you've done.
Great. Thank you, Kumeshni. Who wants to take a first try at that question?
I can.
Really? Yeah.
Yes. I'm not responsible for executive education at our school, so I don't have all the details. But I know that especially for this audience, we are moving a lot of programs online, and that's because the companies want to do the training programs, but they cannot, for their own travel policy, for example, send people to our campus. And so that's where we are currently proposing the largest share of online programs at the demand of the client companies to be able to maintain the activity. And then in terms of how to anticipate the fallout from the financial fallout from cancellations, that's also something that we are looking at on the overall school level, because that the same applies also to our graduate and undergraduate programs. So there we are having twice per week meetings with our financial planning office to update our forecast and to try to estimate the risk that we have from this cancellation part. And then that excludes executive education, but also all of the other related risks in all of our departments.
Anybody want to add to that? If not, I do want to say this morning, we talked about this a little bit, and one school estimated it was about 15 to 20% of their executive education revenue was, that's the extent to which it's off this year, or estimated to be off. I heard similar number from an Australian school, but overall revenue was predicted to be off about 20%. He since said that that may have been a little high, that we managed to manage, but this will turn out to be a pretty significant financial event for schools. And What I've also heard is that in many cases, the way they're managing is through a process of negotiation with the home institution or the overarching university in some cases. In some cases, like ESSEC, that of course is not possible. So, second question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Second question from Sumit Kundu, Associate Dean for International at Florida International University School of Business. Sumit, you now have the floor. Oh, Sumit? Okay, I'll read his question. Should we adopt a blanket travel restriction for a month for international and domestic, or longer?
Maybe David, are you still on the line? Do you want to tackle that? Since we
sure. I think a month is a very short period of time. So our travel restriction at MIT goes through May 15th. I believe it's going to be longer than that. I think because you quarantine people for 14 days, I think that's the latest that I've read. That I think a month is a little too soon. I definitely think international for a longer period of time. And we're also looking at domestic also at MIT. So for business travel. So I would say at least 3 months. That would be my point of view.
Thank you, David. The part of your question, Sumit, that included the word blanket, I have heard some schools, instead of just making a blanket travel restriction internationally, for example, rather using a system of layers of rules, starting with, for example, the domestic country's policy towards travel, but then looking at the host country policy for travel, but also in cases involving companies, what are the companies actually doing? So in some cases, it's been a case-by-case decision rather than a blanket decision. Third question.
Yeah,
and then,
third question from Peter Harrington, who is the CEO of SimVenture, calling in from the UK. Peter, you now have the floor.
Hi there. Thanks very much so far for the webinar. If the coronavirus leads to much greater demand for online learning, period, is that a good thing or a bad thing for business schools?
That's a very interesting one.
Anybody want to take a shot at that? Charles, since we asked this question earlier, Charles.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can't see you anymore, but we can
hear
you.
I'm struggling with my video, actually. I'm wondering what's gone wrong with it. Yes, if it continues for too long, and is it going to be a good thing or a bad thing for business schools if we have to fundamentally migrate to online? That's a very difficult question to answer, but I think that already the online format is a very well-developed format, and therefore I'm not so sure that it's going to be a very difficult transition for business schools to make. However, we have to then think about the impact on the operations of business schools broadly. There are certain things, there are certain, overheads that you must maintain in your operations, whether or not you're fully online. I mean, if your design, your business model is face-to-face or fundamentally face-to-face, and then there are going to be implications for your operations in terms of the financial impact. Now, that's something that business schools will need to think about. However, obviously, I'm thinking that at some point during the course of this year, this will all blow over. And perhaps the opportunity there would be to improve the competencies we have for delivering online programs if that becomes the default for coping. I think I'll leave it there.
does seem like we all have an opportunity to become more resilient because of our experience in moving online.
Precisely, yes.
Great, thanks. One final question, if we could, and then I'm going to turn it back to the panel for some final remarks before we close the webinar.
Okay, last question from Claudia Sampel. She's the Associate Dean of International Relations at Burgundy School of Business in France. Claudia, you now have the floor.
Hi, I hope you can hear me okay. My question was about what was brought up earlier on, that nothing can substitute an international experience, but there has been a trend lately to move to virtual mobility programs, and I wanted to know if any of you had an experience in that field.
Well, that was a comment I made earlier, and no, I don't. I have seen some examples of virtual reality tours, and I do think it's a real possibility moving forward. Anybody want to either support or not support that in the panel? Yeah, Carolyn?
I think there's a lot of opportunities for doing virtual international experiences. And actually before this, we were talking with one of our partners about a course joint project. I think that maybe we should advance this as a default. The other part is nothing for being there physically. Is a qualitatively different experience. The analogy I have is you can watch a cooking show and really appreciate what the food looks like, and it looks great, but you have to actually eat it to understand what that food is and really appreciate it. So I think that what may be happening is we're going to need to be more creative in terms of alternatives, and if a similar during this crisis, and if a similar crisis arises again, being able to quickly move to the virtual option, just so that at least the students are able to have a learning experience internationally.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to move now to our panelists for some final remarks. Anything you wish you would have had a chance to say, or any final remarks for the good of the order? David, you're on first.
Yeah, no, I thought this was great. I like the digital question. I think, it's hard to say if this will benefit us digitally. I think what will help is to find out what technology will work better than others, especially when we're at capacity. How do we price these in terms of digital offerings? But like I think Carolyn said, with student experiences, the best part of all the trips, the treks, the interactions is actually being in these countries and networking, and I think that's going to be hard to replace.
Sure.
Out on it because of this, so that'll be something we'll have to deal with.
Great. Thanks for those remarks. Final remarks, David. Charles, you want to make some final remarks?
You were speaking earlier about resilience, and I think that this experience is an opportunity that enables us to test many of our capacities and competencies. I think that the reality of a global pandemic is something that we must come to terms with. The world is changing, and I think that we really need to begin to anticipate these kinds of events going forward. And it may not always be a disease condition, it may be some other thing. So I think that we, as business schools, we need to take lessons that we're learning from this experience very seriously, and see how to build that into our capacity to adapt to these kinds of events.
Well, thank you so much, Charles. Felix, I know you have to run, Felix. You have to run to another event, but I want to give you some 30 seconds for final remarks.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, I think it's a very fine line of moving between on the one hand side, by protecting our students, protecting our faculty, protecting our staff, protecting the population, etc. And on the other hand, on maintaining a relevant student experience for our students and our activities in general. And so that's a line where on a daily basis, we have to see how do we adjust it in one direction or the other. At the moment, one of our strategies is to follow very closely what the government is recommending, because there's so many interpretations and different opinions. And so there's at least one line that kind of puts a cursor that helps us a lot, and then throughout the 3 different countries. And to finish on an optimistic note, I joined Charles in his assessment that at least let's try to make it a learning experience for the school. So we are building, for example, a business continuity plan that will also help us in the future. We learn about technologies and how to use them to do online learning on a large scale. And that is to finish with at least one positive point.
Thanks, Felix. Carolyn.
Yes, this is an opportunity for us to actually do what we teach in our courses about emergency crisis response and scenario planning and such. And just briefly, let's not forget our staff. We met with our staff, our directors, and how they are on the front line. And what do we do, for example, if they're with daycare, if their daycare child or their children in daycare child or schools, what happens if they close? How do we support them in those kind of events? So yes, thinking about all members of our community is critical throughout this period.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you all of the panelists and the participants. You know, your contributions to this have made us all stronger as a community. And I think long-term, it will make us more resilient. In the previous webinar, one of the panelists, Lee Jones, said we're not witnessing a retrenchment of globalization, but he believes we're experiencing a reglobalization, a stronger, more resilient type of globalization moving forward. So thank you all, and we'll be in touch. The recordings will be available. And at GBSN, we will make an effort to make sure that we support your sharing of ideas and strategies about dealing with coronavirus. And thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Wash your hands. Wash your hands.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.